All right, Daf Kuf Tes Zayin. This is Monday's Daf. So the Gemara was discussing the Makar for the Isser Basar B'cholav. We know the famous one from Tanad Beri B'Shmoel, and it says Leisa Vashel 3 times. But yesterday we were discussing Isi ben Yehuda's Mahalach, because according to Isi ben Yehuda, it was a two-step process. Because number one, the Isser Achila comes from Gzeira Shaveh, from Parshas Re'eh, Am Kodesh Ata, and in Parshas Mishpatim, Va'anshe Kodesh Tiyu and Li, Ubasar B'Treifa Leisa Chelu. So you have Gzeira Shaveh from the Isser Achila of Treifa to Basar B'cholav. So now how do I know Isser Hana? So we learned that from a Kal V'chomer from Arla, that just like Arla had no Avera done to it, but yet it's still going to be Usr. So Kal V'chomer Basar B'cholav, that you did the Avera is going to be Usr B'Hana. Yeah, but the Gemara had asked that Arla is more Chomer because it never had a Shas HaKosher, whereas Basar B'cholav had a Shas HaKosher. So to that the Gemara introduced Chametz B'Pesach, because that did have a Shas HaKosher. So it's this tag team of Chametz B'Pesach and Arla. But then the Gemara says you can't make the Kal V'chomer with this tag team because of the Einish Kares that exists by Chametz B'Pesach that you don't have by Basar B'cholav. So whereas typically the Gemara would still stay within these two different limudim, the Gemara now introduces a third factor, which is Klei HaKerem, because Klei HaKerem is not an Isser Kares, but yet it's still Asr B'Hana. So you see that Kares is not the factor that makes it Asr B'Hana. So the Gemara wanted to know why in the world we even need a Gzeira Shaveh, learn the whole thing from the Kal V'chomer from Arla, because we had an original Kal V'chomer from Arla that we were comfortable with. So do away with our original Gzeira Shaveh, just rely on the Kal V'chomer from Arla to take care of both Isser Achila and Isser Hana, which the Gemara was Deicha the Kal V'chomer from Chayr Shar V'chamar and Chaysim Pipar V'dashba, that even though there was an Avera, they are still mutter afterwards. So let's roll back now a little bit and pick it up again inside at the last skinny line before the lines get wide. Frek the Gemara. Lamli Lamemer Klei HaKerem Yechichu, which is one of the steps the Gemara brought in to show that Isser Kares is not the Nakuda that makes an Isser Hana. In other words, why did Isi ben Yehuda have to bring in this third-party new halacha of Klei HaKerem? Lema Arla Teichiach, that you see you don't need to come onto an Isser Kares for making something Asr B'Hana. V'lehadar Dina v'leisi b'me'atzad. Because just by using Arla, we should be able to make the me'atzad that Basar B'cholav is going to be Asr B'Hana because they all have the same characteristics, meaning Arla and Chametz should cover our bases. Omer Rav Ashi, Mishum Te'ika Lamemer Nevela Teichiach. Nevela has the components of being Asr Ba'achila Umuteres B'Hana. But now that we also introduced Kilayim, that tag team will stand. Frek the Gemara, Omer Le Rav Mordechai Le Rav Ashi, Hachi Amrina Mishmei D'Reish Lakish, Kol Ma'hatzad, Megufay Parchinan, but Me'alma Le Parchinan. When you slug up a Tzad HaShaveh, you show within those things that you're trying to compare that they have unique characteristics that don't also exist by that target thing that you're learning to. But you don't bring a third party kind of outside halacha. That's not the way you slug up a Tzad HaShaveh. So now we go back to our original question. So why don't we learn out Basar B'cholav from Arla and Chametz? Why did Isi ben Yehuda even have to introduce Klei HaKerem to show that Basar B'cholav is going to be Asr B'Hana? To which the Gemara answers, Mishum Dika Lemifrach Ma'ala Tzad HaShaveh Shebehen Shekain Gedulei Karka. There's a uniqueness that these things grow from the ground. And even though Gedulei Karka is not a reason to create an Isra Hana, but it's just different than Arla and Chametz, and therefore it should slug up our Tzad HaShaveh. Well, then Yachi, the Gemara, how did Isi ben Yehuda help it all by bringing in Klei HaKerem? Hashtanami Ika Lemifrach Ma'ala Klei HaKerem Shekain Gedulei Karka. And for the Gemara, Omer Le Rav Mordechai Le Rav Ashi, Hachi Amrina Mishmei D'Reish Lakish, Kol Matzad Parchinan Koldu. When you're trying to slug up a Matzad, all you need is a uniqueness at all. And that uniqueness is that Arla and Chametz have the same Nakuda of growing from the ground, which is not the case by Basar B'cholav. But Loyim Amrit, which is the name of another kind of a limud, a Loyim Amrit, which doesn't use a Tzad HaShaveh Dika Cheshbon. So Kal V'chomer Parchinan, you could slug it up with a Kal V'chomer, but Kolduhu Le Parchinan. You can't just show a Kolduhu distinction. That's not going to be enough to undo the Loyim Amrit. So had we learnt out the Isser Hana of Basar B'cholav only through Tzad HaShaveh, we would have been able to deich it with just this uniqueness. But now that we learn from Kilayim, it's not coming from Tzad HaShaveh, it's coming from Loyim Amrit, and therefore you need to have a stronger Kal V'chomer. Well, Frek the Gemara V'lifrach Lakulu. Let's slug up all three, Arla, Chametz, and Kilayim, that Malakulu Shekain Gedulei Karka. They all have that unique characteristic. And for the Gemara, Elo Omer Le Rav Mordechai Le Rav Ashi, Hachi Amrina Mishmei D'Reish Lakish, moving over to Tamid Aleph, Chada Me Chada, when one thing is being learned from another singular thing. Like, for example, the first step of Isi ben Yehuda's drasha, that Basar B'cholav is learned from Arla, that's how we started this, Kula V'chumra Parchinan. You can show me either a Chumra or a Kula that's connected that target limud, and we can therefore slug it up. In such a case, if there is a Kula or a Chumra that we want to learn, Parchinan, then you'll try to slug that up. But Kol Dule Parchinan. So when Isi ben Yehuda was originally saying that we learn from Arla that Basar B'cholav is Asr B'Hana, you couldn't just simply say that Arla is different than Basar B'cholav because it grows from the ground. That's just a Kol Dehu Dika Chilik. And that won't be enough against a Chada Mechada Dika Limud. But Chada Metarti, once Isi ben Yehuda introduced that Arla and Chametz is going to be the Limud to Basar B'cholav, then Afilu Kol Dehu Parchinan and Chada Metlas, when we now said Klei HaKerem as well, Yihadar Dina V'asi V'me'atzad, and we're going to be chayzer to go in this loop of the Tzad HaShaveh Parchinan Kol Dehu. Even if you find a uniqueness that's just a Parchinan Kol Dehu, it will slug it up, V'ilai. But if it's not going to be this cycle of Mahatzads going around and around, Kula V'chumra chumra parchinan, kol duhule parchinan. So lamaisa, because according to Isi ben Yehuda, we introduced this third din of kalei hakerem to show that the chumra of the iser kares by chametz is not the factor. So we didn't find any chumra inherent to kalayim that doesn't also exist by basar b'cholav, and therefore we didn't have to repeat the whole cheshbon, and we don't need to come out of the tzad hashava. So you can't just use the kol duhu chilik of the fact that it grows from the ground that's shared by all three of these things, and you can't slug it up just simply by finding the chilik. I have a lifrach. Why doesn't Isi ben Yehuda have a problem with the limud from Malak Klei HaKerem Shekein Lo Haisel in Shas HaKosher, which creates a chumra by Klei HaKerem, because the assumption in the Gemara right now is that the actual seeds don't become usher. It's only the product of what grows becomes usher, to which the Gemara now says, Omer Ravada Barahava. Zaysai Meris, from the fact that Isi ben Yehuda didn't taina this, must be that Klei HaKerem Ikra Ne'asar. The actual seeds, even before there's kilayim, those become usher b'hana. V'haisa lahen Shas HaKosher Koydem Hashrasha, meaning those seeds that get planted together become usher, had a Shas HaKosher before they took root. Maser of Rav Shmaya Bar Ze'era. Rav Shmaya Bar Ze'era asks from the Mishnah in the 7th parak of Kilayim, Hamavir otis nakov bekerv, if someone's moving a pot that has a hole in it through the vineyard, im haisif mosayim usher. If it grows 1/200th more while it's moving through, then it's going to become usher, because bittul takes place 1 to 200. But it sounds like only haisif in loy haisif loy. So clearly that which grows as kilayim becomes usher and not the original plant. So how are you telling me that the original Zrayim become usher? Amar Abaya, Trey Kroy Ksivi. You got two different psukim legabe Klei HaKerem. Ksiv pen tikdash hamaleya, which sounds like only that new growth is going to be what's usher. And you also have Ksiv hazera, which sounds like even those Zrayim that you planted also become usher. So okay, so how do you reconcile that? Zorua mi'ikarai. If it was planted already, then bahashrasha, that seed becomes usher when it takes root. Zorua uba, but if it was planted and continues to grow after being brought into the vineyard, haisef in, le haisef lai. Now just agav, an interesting maramokum on this idea of the haisef mosayim, because we're working in that with an idea of bittul. Once you have a 1/200th of growth, it won't be bottle, but any less it will be bottle. So Reb Shlomo Zalman wants to know whatever happened to Shitas Reb Yehuda of min b'mina le bottle. Because this is the same min. So how is bittul going to be understood in such a context? And I didn't see the Reb Shlomo Zalman inside, but it sounds like from the way I heard it in the shir, that Reb Shlomo Zalman says the same idea as the Naidi Yehuda about being neile b'taruvais. You have this concept of neile b'taruvais when things are not independent and they grow within the taruvais. And there's two different kinds of that. You have two independent things that never saw the light of day outside of each other. Like for example, when the Yavama spits and the Reik Yavama has dam in it. So the dam and the Reik are two independent objects, but they never existed independently outside of her body. So because of that, you'll never say bittul. That's one kind of neile b'taruvas. The other kind of neile b'taruvas exists is when the mizbatel exists already and the mavatel grows within it. The classic example is mashkin shesavu. If you have this juice and more peiros are inside the juice and some new juice leak out of it into the existing juice that was already there beforehand, so the new peiros that leak out, and I believe it's going to be either on Yontif or Shabbos, where there's a shiloh of muktzah of neiled, those things will be bottle because they are born into the davar that's being mavatel them. And even though it's the Shishal Matirin, you'll always say bittul. And why do you always say bittul? It's because it's neile b'taruvas. That's the kind of neile b'taruvas that's always is bittul, because it never had its own identity. So it kind of only exists inside of the mavatel and therefore will always be bittul. That Zakr Shlomo Zalman is what this is talking about, because you have the davar mavatel here, this plant, and the davar that's being bittul is growing within it. So it never has its own independent identity and therefore it will immediately be bittul, as opposed to when the mavatel and the mizbatel come into existence at the same time, then it will never be bittul, because then it's a combination. It's like a combination of reik and dam by the Avama, and there's no mavatel misbatel for it to never have an existence. Okay, not quite the sugya, but another application of that concept. Okay, so now we spent the past day talking about the mucker for the isser of basar b'cholav, and that also asers hana, but that is not 100% muskim. Masnisa and the leiki tana de tanya. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon, basar b'cholav is asar b'achila umutter b'hana. There is no isser hana for basar b'cholav. Shenamar ki am kodesh ata v'nemar lahalon v'anshe kodesh tiyun li. So malhalon asar b'achila umutter b'hana afkan asar b'achila umutter b'hana, because that was exer shavu to trefer, and trefer, remember, is not asar b'hana. So the same thing, basar b'cholav is also not asar b'hana according to this Tana of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Shimon. Okay, the Mishnah said Rabbi Akiva Omer chaya v'oif v'chulhu, that according to Rabbi Akiva there is no basar b'cholav by chaya and oif. So now for the Gemara kasha hani ho afkinhu l'chidush Shmuel. We already used these drushes for the dinim of Shmuel. Remember Shmuel from yesterday and 2 days ago's daf that we use one of these loisavashal gedi chol to be mar b'chel chalev, nevela, and one for the shlil, and one to be Mamaya Trefus. So what are you going to do with all these drushes if you're using it up? So Kasav Rabbi Akiva, Isser Chalal Isser. There's no problem because he holds Isser Chalal Isser, and therefore chalev u'meis lo tzricha kra. I don't need a pasuk for chalev and a nevela. And shlil is gedi malyahu, and the unborn fetus of the animal also doesn't need a drusha because that's just a regular gedi. It's just unborn, but it's still a gedi. So iyatru lahu kulu. So therefore, all of these loisavashal gedi b'chol levimos are available for drusha, and therefore prat l'chayv ha'efel u'behema tameya. That's how Rabbi Akiva will use it. Rabbi Yossi Glili Aimer Namar loisaychlu, that you're not allowed to eat any nevela and loisavashal gedi b'chol levimos. Right? That's the hekish. So he darshes whatever's b'chol the isser. Nevela is going to be b'chol the isser basar b'cholav. Now ma'ika ben Rabbi Yossi Glili Rabbi Akiva, because both Rabbi Yossi Glili and Rabbi Akiva are both mamayet b'sar oif from basar b'cholav. And for the Gemara, you can be now chaya. Chaya is going to be a tully in the machlekes. Rabbi Yossi Glili savar chaya da'iraisa, Rabbi Akiva savar chaya is derabanan. Or ibo yisema really oif you could be now. Maybe even actual b'sar oif is going to be the nafkamina. Rabbi Akiva savar chaya oif ena min atayra. But ha midirabanan asire. But for Rabbi Yossi Glili savar oif afilu midirabanan ami lo yaser. Amazingly, according to Rabbi Yossi Glili, it's mamish going to be mutter. And you could just cook your chicken with your milk, even midirabanan. And Tanya nami hachi, we also have a brisa to this effect that b'mekaymei shur Rabbi Eliezer, how you karsen eitzim lasis pechamim lasis barzel. They would knock down the trees on Shabbos in order to be able to make the izemel for bris milah, because they needed the coals in order to fashion the metal. B'mekaymei shur Rabbi Yossi Glili, how you eichlin b'sar oif b'chalav. And now we have a story. Levi ikla lebe Yosef Rijba. Levi came to Yosef the trapper. Aisu lekame reisha the tavsa bechalba. They gave Levi this kind of a bird's head in milk. V'loyomer v'loy midi. He didn't even give them a hard time for eating basar oif with chalav. So kiyasa lekame de Rebbe. When Levi came back to Rebbe to tell the story, Amar Le, Rebbe said to him, Amai loy tashmitinu. Why did you put him in chayrim? For crying out loud, he was eating basar oif with chalav. Amar Le zok Levi asrei Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseirahu. He was the town of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. V'yamina darash luka Rabbi Yossi Glili. And I thought maybe he holds like Rabbi Yossi Glili to Omar Yatza Oif she'en loy chalev, that he is mamayet b'sar oif with isser basar b'cholav because it's not part of the chalev since there's no mother's milk for these birds. But anyway, come to chayis, you see that even in isser d'Rabbanan he wasn't concerned about for b'sar oif with cholav. Lahalacha, of course, we hold it is asur midrabbanan, but this is a viable shitas tanaim. Zok the Mishnah, kevas oived kechavim. The kevas, which over here doesn't technically mean the stomach, it means the enzyme, the rennet that's inside that stomach that you can make cheese with it. So that rennet of an animal of an oived kechavim or v'shel nevela, harezu asura, you're not allowed to eat these things because they have the same status as the animal it came from. Hamamid be'ar shel keva, and let's say you actually put the milk inside the physical stomach of this animal. And as Rashi points out, this is actual fleshix, turning over Tamid Beis. Im yesh b'naisein tam, if there is enough actual flesh of this keva to actually be naisein tam into the cheese, then harezu asura. But it sounds like if there isn't naisein tam, then you're allowed to do it. Why? Because it'll be batal. For Rabbi Akiva Eiger in the Chuvas and Siman Zayin or Siman Vav, how is it mutter to do that? I aim avat l'nesser lechatchila. To which Rabbi Akiva Eiger says a major important chiddush that there is no isser of aim avat l'nesser lechatchila by basar b'cholav, because the way Rabbi Akiva Eiger understands it is that you only say aim avat l'nesser lechatchila when you have a taruvis. But if it's not naisein tam by basar b'cholav, then there's no taruvis here. There's no necessity to be mavatal anything because there's no tam of basar. Weiter, back to the Mishnah. Kshera, let's say you have a kosher animal. Sheyonka min hatrefa. It was actually yoinek from a trefa animal. Kevasa asura. So its kevasa, its rennet is going to be asur. And trefa sheyonka min akshera. Kevasa muteres. Why? Because the rennet is just inside of it. Because the milk turned rennet in this trefa is not trefa milk. It's actually kosher milk because it came from a kosher animal. The fact that it's located currently inside the trefa doesn't make it asur because it wasn't produced by the trefa. It just gathered there. Zok the Gemara, getting back to that first halach in the Mishnah, the kevas avodah zarah nevela is going to be asur to eat. So otu kevas oived kechavim lav nevelahi. So why is the Mishnah breaking this into two cases? L'chayra, the kevas oived kechavim is also going to be the same matzav as nevela. So why does the Mishnah break this into two halachas? Amar Rav Huna, hacha b'lakech kedim oived kechavim maskinan. We're talking about where the kevas nevela was bought from a guy and then the yid shechted it. V'chashinan shema yonak min atrefa. The reason why the rennet is asur because we're chayshish that maybe this gedi was yonek from a trefa. So now the rennet that we're finding inside this gedi, which was perhaps yonek while it was still in the possession of the oived avodah zarah, came from a trefa animal, and therefore it's going to have a din of a trefa milk. The Brisa says, you could buy eggs from a gayim. We go basar raiv by these eggs and say they were laid by birds that were not trefas. So too by our Mishnah, we should go basar raiv and assume that this gedi was yonik from an animal animal that wasn't a treifa, right? Behemoth ain't a treifas. So like the Gemara, le'ema chashin and shema yonik min atmeya. Maybe it was actually being yonik from a non-kosher animal. For the Gemara, maishna treifet le'chashina no maishna tmeya techashina. There's no more of a chash for an animal that's tmeya, and for the Gemara, treifa le'shchicha, but tmeya is shchicha. It's actually more common for a behemoth tmeya, and therefore in a chanami. There is what to be chayshish for. Well, for the Gemara, shchicha. If you're telling me that non-kosher animals are shchiach, then why is the Mishnah only answering the rennet of the animal bought from the guy? Afilu gabe didan nechush, even the gabe our gedis that you're not buying from goyim. You should always be afraid they were yonik from not kosher animals. And therefore, you should answer the rennet that's within them. And for the Gemara, no, it's a big chilik. Anan the badlinan minayu. We stay away from not kosher animals. V'chi chazinan lu, and we see our gedis being yonik from a non-kosher animal. Mefarshinan lu, we would stop that from happening. We would take them away from the not kosher animals. So therefore, it goes through bahu rabban, and therefore we're not going to answer the rennet in that matzav. But inu dolei badilim minayu. But the goyim who are not stopping their gedi from being yonik from a not kosher animal, they're not going to stop it from happening. In that case, goes to bahu rabbanan. Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel says chadakatani. The Mishnah is only telling us one halacha, and this is how you learn it. Kevas shchitas ovid kechavim is nevela. That rennet of an animal that was shechted by a guy has a din of a nevela, and therefore it's usher. It's all one halacha. Did Shmuel say this? That the rennet of a nevela is considered like the animal itself, and therefore it's going to have a din of a nevela? This is the Mishnah Chavtas and Avodah Zarah. That why did Chazal aser cheese of goyim? Mipnei shema midin oisa or kevas nevela. They put it inside the actual stomach of the nevela, meaning they put it with the actual busser of the nevela. But it's mashma hakeva gufa sharia. It's only the busser that's usher, but it sounds like the actual rennet would be mutter. So how are we supposed to understand that Mishnah in Chavtas and Avodah Zarah? Like kasha kan kaidem chazara, kan lacher chazara. In our Mishnah, we were saying this psak of Rabbi Yeshua before his chazara, meaning before he was chayzer to say that the rennet that's inside the nevela is considered like it's part of the nevela. But kan lacher chazara. But Shmuel's explanation that the isser of the cheese of the Avodah Zarah is because it was put into the nevela, which sounds like the rennet's going to be okay, that was going to be after Yeshua's chazara. Okay, the next part of the Mishnah said ksher sheyanka min treifa v'chulu, that if an animal is yonik from a treifa, its rennet's going to be usser, whereas if a treifa was yonik from a kosher animal, it's going to be mutter because the milk is just gathered inside of it. Frek the Gemara. V'hokatani reisha. The first part of the Mishnah told us that kevas ovid kechav mishal nevela harezu asura. So too, that rennet that's inside of the treifa should also be considered part of the animal itself and should be considered a treifa. Omer Rav Chizda, no, reisha chazal asered because nira ka'echel neveles. Aber hacha, but the latter part of the Mishnah where the rennet is found inside a treifa animal, ika shchita, it doesn't have the tzur of a nevela because you did a proper shchita. It just happened to be a treifa. Well, Omer le Rava, v'lav kol dechenu, isn't that a bigger kal v'chaimer uman nevela de miasa? A nevela which inherently is disgusting. It's mos. Di isharis le kevasa. If you want to be matter its rennet inside le osi lamechamine, no one's going to eat the nevela itself. So Amrit le, you're still going to say that rennet is going to be usher to make your cheese with it. So treifa shchuta, which is not nearly as mos. Di isharis, and if you're matter it osi lamechamine, I have a real reason to be concerned that people might actually eat the treifa like kol shekain, should certainly be usher. El Amr of Yitzchak Amr of Yechanan like kasha. Let's have a whole different mahalach here. The difference between the rennet in the kevas nevela and the rennet found in the kevas treifa is kan kaidem chazara, kan la'acher chazara. But in a chanami, u'mishnah le'zozim imkaima, the earlier halacha of the Mishnah that had already been inside the finalized Mishnayos, we didn't change the nusach of the Mishnah. But the bottom line is, we hold that rennet that's found inside the kevas nevela is mutter, just like it is by the treifa, and we never changed the nusach of that Mishnah. And here's where we're going to call it and pick it up with Amar Rabbi Chia for tomorrow's daf.